Good evening. We are going to continue on our study in Proverbs tonight. We had left off last week somewhere around Proverbs chapter 2 and in verse 16. Proverbs chapter 2 and in verse 16. Hope that you guys are doing well. I know that many congregations are getting to meet together, at least in some capacity, over the last week. Unfortunately for us, Colonial Williamsburg is still shut down and we are unable to do that. I hope that we can get together sometime soon, whether it be in someone's house or in a larger group setting somewhere. I hope that's the case. But we're going to be here in Proverbs chapter 2 tonight. We're going to hopefully finish up chapter 2 and then get on into chapter 3. I would like to try to finish chapter 3 tonight. We'll see how that goes. Since we are limited in our format and we are unable to have as much input as we normally would, if we don't finish chapter 3, that is solely my fault. So I will only blame everybody else. So Proverbs chapter 2, there in verse 16, let's just go ahead and read to the end of the chapter. He says, "So you'll be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth, and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death, and her path to the departed. None who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life. So you will walk in the ways of the good, and keep the paths of the righteous. For the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted from it." Remember here, he has begun chapter 2 with a plead for them to receive his words and to treasure up his commandments. Not only that, but then to go and to seek for wisdom, to seek for it like silver, to search for it like hidden treasures. And then he gives a list of things that wisdom is going to do for them. It's going to give them knowledge. It's going to guard them and give them discretion. It will help them to understand justice and understand righteousness. It's going to give them an understanding of equity. He also mentions here throughout chapter 2 that there are several things that if you fail to have wisdom, that failure, that foolishness is going to lead you into it. Or, in the contrast, that wisdom is going to lead you away from certain things. He mentions here that it's going to lead you away from evil in verse 12, as well as it's going to lead you away from men with perverted speech. Part of this is going to be getting into what we're going to be looking at in the later chapters. What kind of company do you keep? What kind of people are you often around? And by looking at the company that you keep, you can often figure out whether or not you are acting in wisdom or acting in foolishness. And in this case, chapter 2, he deals here where that wisdom is going to lead you away from the paths of evil. It's going to lead you away from men with perverted speech. And then also in verse 16, he mentions that it's going to lead you away from the forbidden woman. He'll talk about this more as we talked last week in chapter 5 and also chapter 7. So he'll have a lot more to say about that. So this is just an introduction to that cause. He is going to put this in the context of the things that wisdom leads you to and leads you away from. I find it interesting here that Solomon, obviously being the author of chapter 2, he puts verse 21 and verse 22 in there. It's not interesting that he put it in there. It's interesting that it is Solomon who fails to remember his own words. He mentions that the upright will inherit the land, but the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. Solomon being the one who has his heart turned from God and forsakes the covenant that he had with his God. The kingdom is taken away from his family in the sense that 10 tribes are given over to somebody else, and only 2 tribes get to remain with his son. Though his words prove true, and sad that his words have to prove true for him. As you get into chapter 3, let's go ahead and deal for a moment with this forbidden woman. He will give 2 more larger explanations in chapter 5 and in chapter 7 about her. But this is one, the forbidden woman is obviously someone who's forbidden to you. He mentions here adultery, or the adulterous woman in verse 16. Sometimes also translated as the foreign woman. But this is one who has forgotten the covenant of her God, who has forsaken the companion of her youth, in the very same way that Solomon is going to tell us to rejoice in the companion of our youth. This is a person who forsakes that. And her house sinks down into death. Her path is to the departed, and none who go into her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life. He's not dealing here with the fact that it's impossible, but that is not the case. I mean, the case is that you don't return back to your old way of life after you've walked down this path. There are things that happen after you go into the adulterous woman that never happen again afterwards. So that's what he's speaking of here. So in contrast, in verse 20, so you will walk in the way of good and keep to the paths of righteousness if you do all of this at the beginning of chapter 2, to seek wisdom and to follow after wisdom. And so he then deals here with some of the very, very most important things in the introduction of Proverbs. I mean, it's hard to kind of point out and say what is the most important thing, but it appears that he condenses so much of the key information in the first 12 verses of chapter 3 that it's going to be important for us to take some time with those verses. Verses 13 through the end of the chapter seem to be some type of a psalm or a poem that is written that kind of references and alludes to and condenses and restates much of what's been stated from chapters 1 through the beginning of chapter 3. And so he gives this instruction in chapter 1, in chapter 2, in chapter 3, and then midway through chapter 3, starting in verse 13, he begins to construct this poem that reiterates all the things that he's talked about kind of in a condensed package. And then he'll get into another section there in chapter 4. But let's go ahead and look at the very first 12 verses of chapter 3 together. He says, "My son, do not forget my teaching, and let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace will be added to you. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so that you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and a refreshment to your bones. Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. And then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom, and the one who gets understanding. For the gain of her is better than the gain of silver. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can be compared with her. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her, and those who hold fast are called blessed." I realized I said down to verse 12, and I kept reading. Again, my apologies. And my own fault. I can't blame anyone else other than me tonight. So verses 1 through 12, he encourages him, "My son, forget not my teachings, and let your heart keep my commandments." And then he mentions here that length of days and years of life will be added to them, as well as peace. Remember what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6 when it comes to children. Children, honor your father and mother, for this is the first commandment with promise. He's dealing with Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12. In Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12, he deals with that if you honor father and mother, it will go well with you and you will dwell long on the earth. There is this connection that Solomon's making, that to honor father and mother goes along with the commandments that he's giving them. If you keep my commandments, part of that is going to be honoring father and mother. And those commandments are going to be a length of days and years of life, as well as peace. He reiterates this in the verses that we accidentally read in verse 16 and verse 18. He says, long life is in her right hand, meaning wisdom, and in her left hand are riches and honor. She states that again in verse 18, she is the tree of life to those who lay hold of her. There's certainly a part of it that is just, if you follow wisdom as a truism, your life is going to be possibly quite a bit longer than others. If you can avoid some of the things he deals with later of drug use and of alcoholism, there are some natural things that will say that live longer. Same way when it comes to being a sluggard or not planning your harvest, and how do you deal with those who are angry with you. All of that kind of combines into this idea that wisdom in general lengthens your life as well as gives you peace. He then says, let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Part of the idea of gaining wisdom and searching after it is not just for your own benefit, but that part of wisdom itself is going to be a blessing upon others, which is your steadfast love and your faithfulness to God. He asks them to bind them around your neck and write them on the tablet of your heart. Jeremiah chapter 17 and in verse 1, Jeremiah speaks to his people, and he encourages them to write God's covenant on the tablet of their heart, to use a diamond chisel or an iron chisel to write that on their hearts. He's mentioned already here in Proverbs about things going around their necks or being a pennant for them. He mentions here in chapter 1, in verse 8 and in verse 9, he says, Hear, my son, your father's instructions, forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and a pendant for your neck. He mentions here that these things should be honored. They should be something that you treasure and that you care for, and that they are going to both be a blessing for you and something that gains you recognition. And the point of this is not to just be someone who gains recognition, but to be recognized for the proper things. Individuals, you can think about your own congregation or people that maybe you grew up with. People who hold a place of honor in your mind as being wise or giving good counsel. They didn't do it for the sake of becoming noteworthy. But I bet they earned that spot by the way that they lived. And that's what he's dealing with here. That there's going to be this added benefit that comes about for those who are wise. And so he says, you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. There's a lot of ways that you can get ahead in life, or seemingly get ahead of life in shady dealings and crooked actions towards others. But he says the way that you find true success in the sight of God and man is by the faithful living that he deals with later on, the idea of having just scales and having good business practice, by being honest and upright with other people. Those things that the world sometimes looks down upon, thinking that you're going to take the long way around and they're going to take a shortcut. He says that these things are going to find good favor. True wisdom is going to find good favor and success in life. Part of that may be a proper understanding, a proper perspective of what real success is. I think what he deals with a lot in the later part of chapter 3 is giving us proper perspective. What is success? Are we successful because we're vastly rich? Are we successful because we have a long life full of peace? Part of what David deals with in Psalm 127, we deals where if the Lord establishes the house, and children are a blessing for the father, and grandchildren are also that, as I'm going to get this wrong, as an arrow in the quiver of a warrior, and blessed is a man who has his quiver full of them. Those are the ideas of what do you find success in? What is it that is your marker for a life well lived? And part of that is perspective here in chapter 3 of what is success and what is a life worth living. So he mentions here that if you have wisdom, if you keep his teachings, if you do not forget his commandments, that you will find favor in the sight of man and God. Again, this is a truism. There are some people who may very well look down on you for keeping God's command. There are many people who will disregard you as being foolish or short-sighted, or just not being worthwhile if you do that. But in general, people respect those people who live by God's command. Here in verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. He's going to compare, if you look at verse 5 and verse 7, This is very common in the book of Proverbs, where he'll state it one way in one verse, and maybe a couple verses later, or maybe a couple pages later, he states something extremely similar, but in slightly different wording, for us to get the concept. You're going to notice that a lot in Proverbs. The more we spend time in Proverbs, and the more ideas are repeated and rephrased. If you spend any time in education, if you spend any time as a parent, or really any time with anybody, management or teaching of any kind, the rules are that's real estate. Repetition, repetition, and repetition. And Solomon does that very well here. And he combines ideas through the repetition. So verse 5 is trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. The repetition in verse 7 is be not wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. And so you have this kind of A-B-B-A pattern where we need to, in verse 5, trust in the Lord, which in verse 7 corresponds with fearing the Lord. Those ideas are strongly connected, that we have to trust in him because we fear in him. And we fear him, and therefore we trust him. And then also in verse 5, do not lean on your own understanding, corresponds in verse 7 of be not wise in your own eyes. Part of what we're going to be looking at here throughout Proverbs, and obviously it is going to be laid out for us in Solomon's own life, is the time that he leans on God. He is vastly successful in all aspects, spiritually as a leader of his country, in just sheer wisdom and knowledge, and a success in his personal life. Whenever he begins to stray away from that, all kinds of ruin comes to him. And we see that in Solomon's life, and he lays that out for us here in his book, that if we follow God, no matter what we personally think on the issue, success is laying ahead of us. But whenever we abandon God, whenever we stop fearing him, whenever we stop obeying him, or stop trusting in him, and we start leaning on our own understanding or what we want, then failure is always going to lay around the corner. And these two verses, verse 5 and verse 7, are extremely important to the whole book of Proverbs. If we view ourselves as being wise or understanding, if we just trust in our own instincts or our own feelings or our own ability to reason through things, then all of the book of Proverbs will mean nothing to us. What we have to do in order to gain wisdom is we have to buy it. And when we buy it is at a price. And the price that we buy it at is our own pride, our own self-sufficiency, if you will, our own understanding. We have to give up those things in order to buy wisdom and insight and instruction. There's a price that is paid by that, and that comes from us giving up of ourselves. And that's what he's dealing with here in verse 5 and in verse 7. We are probably, a lot of us, decently well educated. Kind of looking at some of the screen, on the screen who we have with us. We have people in computer fields and educational fields. We have people who are doctrinal candidates, individuals who've been teachers all their lives and have been speakers in conferences. We have a pretty well-educated crowd just on our very small Facebook Live feed tonight. And yet, to gain true insight, to gain true wisdom, that other stuff doesn't really matter a whole lot. If our thoughts do not correspond with God's thoughts, then our thoughts really aren't worth a whole lot. There are a lot of times where we're going to open up the Bible and we're going to find things that maybe we don't really think are the best idea, that we think that they probably should work out a bit differently, that we should act differently. There will be times in our life where we think, I can avoid this problem if I only act in the way that I want to act. And I don't know if it's going to be that big of a deal if I act differently. That's what we're dealing with here. At the very core, do we follow God only whenever we think it's the best idea, or do we follow God even when it goes against our own personal feelings? And that's huge. That is really, really big, to consider. There are so many people in the world who will open the Bible, they'll believe that it's inspired, they'll believe that it's God's word revealed to mankind, and they'll follow a large percentage of it thinking, yes, this is the kind of person that I ought to be. But in the times where God's will conflicts with their will, when God's commandments are against what they currently want to do in their life, they'll abandon God in a heartbeat. And oftentimes we do the same thing. But if we want to be the wise here in the book of Proverbs, we can never do that. We can never lean on our own understanding. Romans chapter 3, there in verse 4. Let's go ahead and turn over to Romans chapter 3 and verse 4. Now, he asked this question earlier. If some were unfaithful in verse 3, does their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? He mentions, by no means let God be true, though everyone were a liar. Everyone includes us. We need to have that mentality that God is going to be right, and God is always going to be right. And God is going to be more right than I am, even in my most right day. That's the point. When it comes to gaining wisdom and insight, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all of your ways, in verse 6, acknowledge him and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. He mentions here the benefits in verse 8. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. We mentioned Psalm 127 already, and I want to kind of reiterate that. In the first few verses in Psalm 127, David deals with, unless the Lord does it, there's no point to it. Unless the Lord establishes the house, the builders build in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. The same point comes about in our lives. Obviously Psalm 127 is an analogy overall for our lives, and while he gives some true specifics, he uses the same kind of wisdom that Solomon uses here in the book of Proverbs. It is very true for the house, it is very true for the city, but the overall point would be for us, our personal lives, that the Lord does not establish our ways. If our ways are not established on his precepts and his command, then what good are we doing? How much success can we really have in this life? What kind of ultimate ends are we looking forward to? And along that line, he mentions here in verse 9, he says, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of your produce. And your barns be filled with plenty and the vats will be bursting with wine. Part of what he's dealing with here is the making sure that you never skimp on your service to God, whether it be the first fruits. Would be part of their offering, part of their giving system. The first fruits belong to God. We live in a time frame where we have refrigeration and we have import and export all around the world. And if you want to have a pineapple out of season, or if you live in a climate where pineapples do not grow, you can still have fresh pineapple pretty much year round. The same kind of goes for whenever you have your I want to give two ideas going forward with this. The other one being whenever you have your first amount of crops that come in the spring, or in the early summer, or in the late summer, whatever you happen to be growing. Do you know how well your bounty is going to be? And I know there's been a lot of times where you have, Brittany has 2 peach trees growing up front. I think she counted 150 peaches thereabout for this year. Last year, she had to pick up all the buds, made sure that the tree grew and we didn't waste all of this energy growing fruit. She left 4 peaches last year. And the very day where we said, those look right. Whenever we get home from church, we need to pick those and eat those because we don't want to have them go to waste. While we were gone, all 4 of them were picked by the squirrels and carried off. Do you know what your produce is going to be whenever you have your first fruits? And the answer is no. If your first fruits are pretty good, there's always a chance of a crop blight coming through or insects coming through and eating them. There's always a chance of a storm coming through and wrecking the rest of it. The same time, there are some things you wait all year for. Brittany we just picked our very first strawberries out of Brittany's garden. We've been waiting 2 years for them. And I gotta tell you, they are some of the best strawberries we've ever had. There is something about the longer you wait for something, the sweeter the reward is. And when it comes to giving the first fruits to God, both of those things come into aspect. When you give to God the thing you've been waiting for, the thing that's going to taste the best, that's a pretty big sacrifice. As well as, if you give to God the first fruits, are you guaranteed, human wisdom, human logic, are you guaranteed the rest of your crop? If you give away the very first of it, do you know that the rest of it's coming in? And that gets back to the the previous verses in verse 5 and verse 7. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. And part of that, in verse 9, is to honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of your produce. There's a lot of other ways to honor the Lord with your wealth that Solomon deals with. He mentions there, as we get down into Proverbs 19 and verse 17, whoever lends the poor lends to the Lord. The same thing goes in Proverbs 22 and verse 9, that the one who is with a bountiful eye is called blessed. And the bountiful eye there in the context of 22:9 is the idea of someone who views their wealth generously and then gives generously. That's the context of verse 9 in chapter 22. There's a variety of other ways, specifically verses 27 and 28 here in chapter 3 that we'll deal with in a moment. That honoring God with our wealth is going to be huge. I mean, how much of the Bible do we have that's given over to the downfalls, the pitfalls that go along with wealth? Most, or a lot, in Proverbs, and a lot over in 1 Timothy. I mean, all of 1 Timothy chapter 6 seems to be given over to the concept of wealth and how we handle that, or the love of money, or the desire for wealth. What if we took the thing that could be a hindrance to us and used that as a way of honoring God? That's what Solomon's dealing with in verse 9. Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of your produce. And then remember, we asked the question, if you give to God the first fruits, do you know that the rest is coming? And the answer in verse 10 is, if you honor him with the first fruits, then your barns will be filled to plenty and the vats will be bursting with wine. That includes faith. And then verse 11 and verse 12, which is probably the verses that maybe sound most familiar to our ears. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, nor be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. This is quoted in Hebrews chapter 12. That's why these two verses probably seem pretty familiar to us. We've already mentioned back in chapter 1, verse 25, that those who are foolish despise discipline or despise reproof. He mentions this again in chapter 5 and verse 12, and chapter 12 and in verse 1. The concept of accepting discipline and accepting reproof comes up over and over again through the book of Proverbs. How do you get off the wrong path if no one ever corrects you? How do you get back on the right path, or how do you know that you left the right path unless someone comes along and tells you? And if you're too proud to hear them, how will you ever be corrected? That's what he's dealing with here in these next two verses. When it comes to God, sometimes God disciplines us directly. We're not always told exactly how or when, but we're told to look for that, or maybe even to expect that in our lives. In fact, that's the point that the Hebrew writer makes in Hebrews chapter 12, that the Lord disciplines every son whom he receives, and he chastises every child of his. I mean, that's the whole point, is that this is something that is common, and we should understand that and should take that in stride. And so, as we look here in Proverbs, he deals with wisdom itself, calls for us to listen to wisdom's reproof, and that if wisdom comes from God, then the discipline and the reproof also come from God. And then he gives the analogy in verse 12 of how fathers should act with their children. In fact, he gives further instructions later on in Proverbs on how we as parents should discipline and correct the children. That foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction drives it far from him. Those instructions also are later in this book. And then starting in verse 13, he seems to give this poem or this psalm or this given over to kind of condensing and restating a lot of the things that he's talked about. And so what we're going to find in the next few verses are not going to be shockingly different, but a way of kind of coalescing some of those ideas together. So starting in verse 13, blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding. For the gain from her is better than the gain from silver, and her profit better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand, and her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all of her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her, and those who hold fast are called blessed. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the depths are broken open, and the clouds drop down the dew. My son, do not lose sight of these. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, and they will be life for your soul and adornment for your neck. Then you will walk in your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. If you lie down, you will not be afraid, and when you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden terror, or the ruin of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence, and will keep your feet from being caught. Do not withhold good from those whom it is due, and when it is in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, go, and come again tomorrow, and I will give it, when you already have it with you. Do not plan evil against your neighbor, who dwells trustingly beside you. Do not contend with a man for no reason when he has done you no harm. Do not envy a man of violence, and do not choose any of his ways. For the divisive person is ambitious, or a devious person is an abomination to the Lord, but the upright are in his confidence. The Lord's curse is on the house of the wicked, but he blessed the dwelling of the righteous. Towards the scorner he is scornful, but to the humble he gives favor. The wise will inherit honor, but the fool gets disgrace. As you probably have picked up, a lot of the things he mentioned in verses 1 through 12, he has restated through this section. As well as some things in chapter 2. Chapter 2 is, seek for wisdom, call out for insight, raise your voice for understanding, search for it like silver, look for it like hidden treasure. He then repeats that idea in verse 13. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding. That there is the process of both looking for it and seeking for it that goes along with gaining it. And then he gives you perspective. I mentioned that before, that a lot of what happens here through the rest of chapter 3, I think, is giving us, or trying to give us, proper perspective on what is valuable in life. He mentions back in chapter 1, the whole house full of bounty, all of the riches of the plunder, and yet compared to them, here in verse 14, gain from wisdom, and he uses the feminine she, because he personified wisdom back in chapter 1, he will re-personify wisdom throughout the book. The gain from her of wisdom is better than of silver, and her profit is better than gold. What do we value in life? Do we value wisdom more than silver and more than gold? We should. That's his point. That she is more precious than jewels, and there is nothing that you desire can compare with her, and including the ways of the evil, including the bounty of the wicked, including the perverse speech of the fools, and also the forbidden woman. All those things pale in comparison to wisdom. For, in verse 16, long life is in her right hand, and her left hand are riches and honor. Remember what we mentioned before back in verse 2 of chapter 3. For length of days and years of life and peace, they will be added to you. He mentions those same things. In verse 17, her ways are the ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. And he'll deal with personal relationships and how to have a better home life, how to have better relationship with friends and with neighbors, employees, employers, how to have good relationships in business practices. And while all of these are truisms, they are very true. that he's dealing with here a pleasant life and a path of peace. Peter asked that question. Those who desire to love life and to see good days are going to be individuals who are going to be drawn to God's commandments. Which, as you look at that, you say, well, I desire to love life and to see good days. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 10, he says, let him keep his tongue from speaking evil and his lips from saying deceit. He's quoting there from the book of Psalms, but that same wisdom is carried over here in Proverbs. That there is this idea that to see good days, to enjoy life, goes hand in hand with gaining knowledge. And there are a lot of people who have a lot of bounty in life, but have no joy. And that's what he's dealing with here, to how to have joy. Verse 18. She is the tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold fast are called blessed. We look back in verse 4. Verse 18 and verse 4 go hand in hand together. Verse 4, you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. And the same idea here. Those who gain wisdom, those who find lady wisdom, are those who are called blessed. And then he mentions here that the Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens. And it kind of seems maybe slightly out of context that, you go with lady wisdom, lady wisdom, lady wisdom, and repeating of previous ideas in chapter 3 to, well, the Lord founded the earth by wisdom, and the understanding he established the heavens, and by his knowledge the deeps were broken open, clouds dropped down their dew. But I would suggest this directly connects with the verse 5 and verse 7. Verse 5, to trust in the Lord with all your heart, and then verse 7, be not wise in your own eyes, but fear of the Lord, goes directly with verse 19 and verse 20. If by some way you could understand perfectly how God made the earth, would that at all give you the ability to replicate it? I would suggest not. That's part of what we look at towards the end of the book of Job, where God doesn't give answers, but he tries to give Job perspective by the questions that he asked. Where was Job? Where were you, Job, whenever I made all these things? And even after I made them, how involved are you in propagating these things and keeping them continuing? That's what Solomon's doing for us. He's giving us this insight when it comes to why do we trust the Lord? Because the Lord, by wisdom, founded the earth. He will always have more than us. Why do we fear the Lord in verse 7? Because by his knowledge the deeps were broken open and the clouds dropped down their dew. He is stronger than we are, and he is wiser than we will ever be. And so he encourages us in verse 21, my son, do not lose sight of these. Keep sound wisdom and discretion. He kind of repeats this idea later on in the book, to buy wisdom, to gain insight, and do not sell it. Don't give it up for anything. And they will be life for your soul and an adornment for your neck. He's mentioned that before in verse 3. Bind them around your neck and write them on the tablet of your heart. In verse 23, he says, then you will walk in the way securely and your foot will not stumble. He's already mentioned this as well, that the Lord will make your path straight, and that you will lie down and you will not be afraid, and when you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Chapter 1, verse 33, whoever listens to me will dwell securely, this is Lady Wisdom speaking, and will be at ease without dread of disaster. All these ideas are things that he's already put forward, but he's putting them into a nice package for us to kind of condense. We do that all the time in the circles of education, that where you give a kind of a lengthy explanation for all of these things, and then you repeat it in a nice condensed package so that they can pick all that additional information together and kind of package it together nicely for them. And so Psalm 4 and verse 8 kind of goes along with that the sleep of the righteous is sweet. In Psalm 127 verse 2, he mentions there that the Lord gives to his righteous sleep. And he'll mention, kind of negative sleep as you go through the rest of the book as well. When you deal with blessings, we think of a lot of physical things, the physical possessions that we get. Sometimes we think of less physical things, but family and friends. And sometimes we leave out things as small as sleep. But if you are an individual maybe who struggles with sleep, then sleep is a huge blessing whenever you get to have it in abundance. Or if you have fitful sleep, having good sleep is huge. And part of that, I think, is what we deal with here in verse 24. And not having to wrestle with our conscience, not having to wrestle with God, that sleep will be sweet for those who gain wisdom. In verse 25, he says, do not be afraid of sudden terror or the ruin of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your feet from being caught. He then, in verse 27, refers to, I think, some of those ideas back in verse 9. Verse 9 is honor the Lord with your wealth, and then I think he gives us a couple instructions in verse 27 and verse 28. Do not withhold good from those whom it's due when it's in your power to do it. That, to honor the Lord with your wealth also deals with taking care of those who are God's. As well as verse 28, don't say to your neighbor, go and come again tomorrow, and then I will give it to you, when you already have it with you. To not be stingy, to not be miserly, to be generous with those things. Generosity and godliness often go hand in hand. That's important for us to consider as we go forward. We'll look at many more verses as you go through Proverbs that deal with these topics. And then he kind of gets back to some of the things he's talked about before, where in Proverbs chapter 1, he deals with not lying in wait to shed innocent blood or scheming evil things. He repeats that in verse 29. Do not plan evil against your neighbor who dwells trustingly beside you. There's a lot of truth in it, that if you want to live in a nice community, be a nice neighbor. It's not going to say it's going to fix all your problems, but if enough people hold the view that they want to live in a nice neighborhood, then they're going to live in a nice neighborhood. There's a book called The Tipping Point. I don't know if I fully recommend all of it, but he made the point of what happens in neighborhoods, or how do neighborhoods change their overall persona? How do they change their crime rates? And he gave an analogy of a community who decided to fix up just broken windows and abandoned buildings, and also graffiti, taking care of what seemingly is two extremely minor things. Minor being, if you want to fix up your community, well, obviously arrest drug dealers and get criminals off the street, and all these other things. And yet, where they started was broken windows and abandoned houses and graffiti. And by fixing those two things, people in the neighborhood started getting the idea that the way that we present ourselves and the way that we act in our community is important. And it actually, over a couple of years, changed the community drastically. We see this a lot with gentrification in a lot of neighborhoods, where just doing a facelift and renovating things and making them look better, people tend to act better as well. That isn't all what he's dealing with here, but that goes along with it. If you want to live in a nice community, spreading evil and spreading treachery is going to make that impossible for you. If you want to live in a better place, then make it a better place. Don't plan evil against your neighbor and those who dwell trustingly beside you. Do not contend for a man for no reason when he's done you no harm. Don't envy a man of violence, and don't choose any of his ways. For the devious person is an abomination to the Lord, but the upright are in his confidence. The Lord's curse is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the dwelling of the righteous. Towards the scorners he is scornful, but to the humble he gives favor. Very, very similar idea that we get over in James. The Lord is gracious to the humble. And the wise will inherit honor, but the fools get disgrace. Part of wisdom is looking further than sometimes we normally do. To not be short-sighted, but to be long-sighted. To not look at what I can get today, but what can be produced later on. Not just how can I handle my money right now, but what is God going to be able to produce in me later on. If I'm devious now, maybe I can make a quick buck, or maybe I can get something that I really want quickly. But do I really want to be an abomination in God's eyes later on? Do I want to be someone who's in his confidence? Part of that is going to be that long-sightedness that we are encouraged to have. And not to look for the quick payoff, but to look ultimately towards the reward that comes from God. There is so much here in chapter 3, and understanding chapter 3 and getting that lodged into our mind is going to be really important as we move on through the book. As I mentioned before, chapters 1 through 9 all work together as an introduction to the Proverbs themselves. These are not Proverbs in the same sense that chapters 10 and following are going to be, those short statements that are going to be easily memorizable, that are very concrete, but yet also speak truth to other aspects of life. This is more of a narrative. This is more of a narrative towards what it looks like to be wise, a narrative of what it looks like to be a fool, a narrative to say that these are what you should be desiring and what you shouldn't be desiring. It is giving perspective of what wisdom is going to lead you to and what wisdom is going to lead you away from. What foolishness is going to lead you to and what foolishness is going to lead you away from. Also that whenever we get to chapter 10, we are properly prepped in our minds and our hearts to fully accept the things that God gives. Because we're not going to lean in our own understanding. We're not going to be wise in our own eyes. We are going to truly trust in the Lord and fear him and turn away from evil and do good. Hopefully, chapter 3 has been enlightening to you as it has to me. I hope it's been much, much more enlightening to you, just because I'm a bit more thick-headed than most people, and it takes me a lot longer to learn things the hard way. Lord willing, next week we'll pick up in chapter 4. We may get through chapter 4 and dabble in chapter 5. I'm not entirely sure. So just to be safe, please read through chapter 4 a couple times. Look over chapter 5 a couple times as well, and we will get into those subjects next week, Lord willing. I hope that you're doing well, and Lord willing, we will see you guys next week. Good night.